The Sustainable Development Goals, known as the SDGs, were established to tackle universal issues facing humanity, such as poverty, hunger, disease, and gender equality, access to education, decent work, and clean energy, as well as other environmental, economic, and social issues. The SDG slogan, "Leave no one behind," embodies the fact that they are by far the largest UN global humanity project. Based in Songdo, Korea, the United Nations Office for Sustainable Development, also known as the UNOSD, serves to help implement the SDGs. Through knowledge sharing, policy analysis, education, and partnerships, the UNOSD supports the UN member states to implement sustainable development strategies. On today's Heart to Heart, we will hear from Mr. Jean d'Aragon, officer in charge at the UN Office for Sustainable Development. August 12th marks the 20th anniversary of Arirang TV's satellite broadcasting service, expanding its broadcasting coverage beyond Korea to countries around the world. Throughout the years, Arirang TV has worked as a bridge to connect Korea and the world through a wide spectrum of programs to the audiences worldwide. The United Nations Office for Sustainable Development, UNOSD, also works to promote Sustainable Development Goals, also known as SDGs, otherwise known as global goals, through various activities. Today we are joined with Jean d'Aragon, officer in charge at the United Nations Office for Sustainable Development in Incheon, Korea. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, thank you very much for having me to your program.
Thank you. Now, as I've mentioned briefly, it has been 20 years since the launch of Arirang TV's satellite broadcasting or global broadcasting service. And I would like to begin by asking you about the UNOSD. So when was the UNOSD established, and what does it aim for?
Yeah, UNOSD was established in 2011. And it was through a host country agreement with the government of Korea and the United Nations, particularly the United Nations Department of Social and Economic Affairs in New York. And within the government of Korea, there was our partners are the Ministry of Environment, we have Incheon City, and also Yonsei University, who are our partners in this venture, if we can say.
So I heard that the most significant UNOSD goal would be to universally implement the SDGs.
Yes, not implementing ourselves, but helping the member states, the UN member states, to implement and develop strategies to implement the SDGs. You know.
So could you maybe elaborate on these universal goals and targets of the SDGs, and also tell us why they are important?
Yeah, there's 17 development goals, or SDGs, and 169 targets. They're all connected together. What is interesting, and then this is something that sometimes I'm asked by students when I'm lecturing, is that they're connected to our lives. So they're universal, and then they're connected to every aspect of our lives.
All right. Now, let's talk about the MDGs.
Yeah.
The Millennium Development Goals, known as MDGs, started a global effort in year 2000, and it expired in 2015, and the SDGs carry on the work begun by the MDGs. So could you tell us about the successful outcomes of the MDGs and possibly the challenges as well? Yeah,
I think that the MDGs were quite good. If you remember, there were 8 goals, and there were 28 or 20-something targets. And so they were very simple, but at the same time, having many different issues related to in the same goals. For example, the goal 8 on the environment was also dealing with ending poverty or helping the slum dwellers. And in my mind, in a way, it was somehow putting the environment issues on the, how to say, maybe to making the poor a bit responsible of the environment by saying, under the environment goal, we need to help to end poverty or help the slum dwellers, for example. It's like a bit putting the responsibilities in the poor. This is my personal take on it. And in this case, if we compare to the SDGs, there are so many, like 17 goals, addressing different aspects of our lives.
So could you tell us in more detail about how different the SDGs are and what might be some of the objectives worth paying particular attention to?
Yes, I think that, I mean, if I go back to the MDGs, and there may be the challenges were in eradicating poverty, for example. I think that was one of the goals of the SDGs, of the MDGs, sorry, and this was not reached. For other people, depending on the perspective, other people came up with the idea of sustainable consumption and production was a main item, in a way, that were missing in the MDGs, which are now integrated into the SDGs. I see. You know.
Now, what activities are carried out by the UNOSD to promote sustainable development?
Well, we do mainly, we don't, you know, we're not like other groups like UNDP, you know, if you, in the United Nations program, development program, we're not working directly in the countries to do projects. Right. We rather bring the policymakers and we bring them often in Incheon to our head office or in different countries to well, to give them more information about the SDGs and the strategies, how to improve the policies, for example, to reach the SDGs.
Okay, and are we speaking about the executive training courses for policymakers?
For example, the executive training course for policymakers is really directly targeting the policymakers. And yes, and then normally we bring the policymakers together, but we also bring experts from different countries, academics, also other UN groups. And then we give them a training on the SDGs. You know.
I see. Which countries are most actively engaged in these activities?
That's a very difficult question. It reminds me also, sometimes people are asking me about which SDGs is more important, and they're all together. You know, they're all so connected that we cannot really say that the one is better than the other. I think that the important point here is that all the countries are trying to, or aiming to, striving to, if you will, implement the SDGs at their pace, according to their needs and the priorities. The good thing about the SDGs is not only doing implementing the SDGs for doing the good for the population or the world. It's also about the country themselves.
I see. Could you also tell us about the Sustainable Transition Development Forum?
Yeah, we in the UN we often talked about with acronyms, the SDTF, or the Sustainable Development Transition Forum. This is interesting. It's also a flagship activities of UNOSD, and it's very different in a way if we compare to the executive training, because the executive training we're bringing policymakers together, and then we teach them. In the case of the forum, it's really a forum bringing still the policymakers, because we're working with the policymakers mainly, but then we bring them, and we bring also together representatives from the civil society, the private sector, academics, and then we talk still about the challenge and the successes of implementing the SDGs, but then also criticizing a bit the SDGs themselves, so how we can improve them to make a better impact or a greater impact, positive impact in realizing them.
Right. There are also programs or forum programs that are held locally. So I'd like to ask you about that as well. What topics are discussed by the forum and where are they usually held? Because I said locally.
Yeah. This is interesting. We implement other forum locally. However, what comes to my mind is the International Mayors Forum, which is still international, but we implement them in different regions.
Yes.
The first one was in Asia, in Laos, PDR, where we brought mayors from around the world. And then we also had one in Africa, in Lilongwe, Malawi, where we brought people from around the world in this region. The idea of bringing the Mayors Forum to localize the SDGs, you know that all the national governments are responsible for the implementation of the SDGs, and then normally these are our partners. At the same time, we all know that the SDGs are mostly implemented at the local level. You know, and this is the good thing with the SDGs, is that everyone has something to do, and then locally it's very important. So the idea is to bring together mayors from around the world and discuss about, again, their challenges, about sometimes their success, or, well, we say their experience, the lessons learned. And then also we bring, again, in this case, we bring also experts to help them. So we have a part of, it's still a training,
yes,
but at the same time, it's a forum where mayors, they can exchange together about their challenges in a very, not completely informal, but more informal way at some point. Yeah.
Now, was it this past May? I understand the executive training course for policymakers, as you've mentioned earlier, was held in Songdo, which is the western port city of Incheon here in Korea. Now, we were there, Ari랑TV. So here's footage of the executive training course for policymakers on the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. So we'll be back right after this. The UNOSD hosted the Executive Training for Policymakers on the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, to enhance the performance of policymakers in their respective fields. The training was attended by policymakers, experts, and staff from civic groups and UN organizations from around 70 countries. Argentina, China, Jordan, and other countries all took part, which sparked a lively atmosphere on site. Officer in charge, Jean d'Aragon, elaborates on the UNOSD, a UN office that runs SDGs-related programs. The UNOSD is an international organization based here in Korea, in Songdo. And I'm sure you receive a lot of questions from government officials, participants regarding Korea's, I guess, successfully implemented the SDGs.
I think yeah, it is similar. Then I would say that you know, the SDGs, they were following the MDGs, but before that, people were talking about the sustainable development. And I think what is important, the last 50 years, Korea has developed very much. I mean, it's impressive, the development of Korea in terms of economy,
Absolutely,
for example.
Yes.
And one of the things, I'm myself, I mean, an architect, engineer, urban planner, and I'm very impressed about how Korea succeeded to go from a rural, you know, to almost completely urban nation. And so Korea is urbanized at 90%. This is very impressive. And this is, of course, for countries like in Africa, where urbanization, for example, is happening, but with some very important challenges. For example, we have a lot of slums going with the urbanization. I think Korea could show a lot of good, interesting examples in this case, for example.
Now, shifting our focus to the annual SDGs youth summer camps for students. This year's camp was held for 4 days, starting on July 29th, I believe, up until the very beginning of August. So could you tell us about the ones which were held 2 years ago? Because I understand they were held for university students. Previously for 2 years, and then this year it was for youths. So what led you to organize the camp, and what kinds of opportunities are provided for the participants, for the students?
Okay. I must say that, we started with students from 2 universities, and then I was quite successful. The idea, in a way, we want to broaden the scope.
Yes.
We invited also international students not working, well, working, yes, but studying in Korea.
I see.
And eventually we want to, now you mentioned youth, without necessarily being at university. The idea is to broaden also, because this is part of society that is very important as well. And then I think we should integrate all the youth in, working towards the SDGs. Yeah.
So as you have mentioned, you did have students or students from abroad that are actually here studying in Korea. Do you possibly, I guess, plan to organize or hold programs, these youth summer camps, for students from abroad to actually come to, take part as well?
That's a very good question, because this is exactly what we aim to. We want to make this program, this program is growing every year, and we want to make it like an international program. And the idea is not only to bring students from, international students together with the students from Korea and youth, but also so that we want to, I think this is a bit what Arirang is doing, trying to also to teach or to show the culture, Korean culture to others, but also to bring the other cultures to the Korean community. And this is what in a way, what we're doing, but at the youth level.
Okay, now for our viewers that may be very curious, here is a video clip of the SDGs Youth Summer Camp organized by the UNOSD.
SDGs are the one educate and encourage ourselves to make our society environment much better.
We realize that youth has a very important role in order to achieve the SDG 2013.
Uh, 20 years ago, this is when Ari랑TV launched its global broadcasting service. This was when you were a postgraduate student. So what was your area of focus, and was it related to your current work?
Yeah, my area of focus was architecture, engineering, and urban planning. And it is quite related to what I'm doing now, although I'm not doing urban planning, I'm not doing building as such. But I think that, from what I got from my engineering background is like problem solving, for example. And to turn problems into solutions and even innovation. I think that's where I'm trying to use this in my current work. So looking at all the issues we're talking about the SDGs, but everything, and then in the day-to-day work, trying to look at the problems more as opportunities to improve how the system is working. So not only fixing the problems to bring them at the state they were before, before they broke, but to improve the system, so to address the root cause that created the problems in a way. So I think that this is where my background is very important, and then I use it every day.
I see. I understand that you also lectured and taught as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
I did lecture. I mean, I lectured in different universities. I lectured in France, in Brazil, in McGill University, for example, at different universities in Canada. Or I'm Canadian, and then I thought it was very interesting to this part of my life. I really enjoyed. And it was very interesting to work with students and see how they have sometimes very innovative ways of looking at things. Sometimes maybe missing some technical hints or aspects. And then this is where I know I could help. But I think it was very an interesting part of my life.
Speaking of an interesting part of your life, now you have worked at many UN agencies before coming to Korea. So you may have answered this question already, but if by chance, if you could tell us, was there a time, when do you think you were most passionately involved in the work that you did? When was it?
Of course, yes, I mentioned to work in the field with people. I think that was really, really interesting. But to work in the field and then having the background, the intellectual background, to reflect on it and to see how it is important to work and then to bring all the stakeholders together. I think this is the most important thing this brought to me. You know. And then, so I did I worked with UN Habitat in Kenya, for example, where I worked in the slums, and not only of Kenya, but also in Africa, but also working with the policymakers. And that was very interesting to bring the experience. I did succeed to bring same thing as I mentioned. I brought the slum dwellers together with the researchers. I did the same with, Minister of Housing and bringing slum dwellers, and then bringing them at the same table and discussing about the reality of the problems. And I think again, this was very an interesting time. But at the same time, I think now it's very interesting because this background I have, collected over the years is really helping me to discuss. Now I'm mostly dealing with, ministers or policymakers as well. But this knowledge of the reality that I gained through the field, and also the reflection through my PhD studies and reading and writing and research, then this brings me, more profound knowledge to discuss with the ministers or the policymakers. And they understand that we talk the same language, or I understand what are their problems. So I think that's an interesting part of it. Yeah.
Yes, you've mentioned with 11 years left until 2030 to achieve each sustainable development goal, I'd like to ask you, what activities will the UNOSD carry out?
What we have to do, we find out that in many areas we in general, I say, not UNOSD, but all the member states, we have success stories, implementing the SDGs. Some others are not so yet successful. And I think we need to accelerate the implementation of the SDGs. We try to put people together to learn how to work together, work better together. And basically, we say 2 + 2 = 5. So that's a way of doing all the energy together to even multiply the impacts. So that I would say this is the most important things. This is what we will be doing in the future, and then starting now. And I think this is what we all should be doing together.
So as you've mentioned, to accelerate and also to multiply the impact, it's important to have people working together. So I'd like to ask you, Amita, the SDGs are becoming a priority issue here in Korea as well. So what could we do to strengthen cooperation among businesses, governments, NGOs and foundations and others to become a key development actor in achieving these goals together?
I think again, we need to bring more people into it. All the stakeholders. The private sector is a very important, again, actor.
Yes.
That is not enough put or brought into contribution in the SDGs. I think the will is there. We have to stop, I think, to see the private sector as being against the SDGs. I think they see the interest. They see that the planet is going very badly, the environment. They see the impact of climate change. And we receive more and more requests from the private sector to how they can contribute. I think we have to bring the private sector. Not only the private sector, but the private sector is an important actor. We need to learn how to work together because we have different ways of doing. So we have to change our mentality. Even the UN has, I'm speaking personally, so I'm not talking for the UN. I'm not representing the UN here, but I think within the UN, we have a different culture of working. We know that the private sector is different. And then also actors of the civil society, we have to bring them together. And we need to learn more about how we can work together. That's an important thing we need to do.
Then how can Arirang contribute? What can Ari랑TV do?
That is a very, very interesting question because I see that Arirang has done so well in, bringing, the Korean culture in the world, but also bringing the rest of the world's culture to the Koreans. And I think that in that sense, Ari랑TV did really good work. And then I think Arirang should use this experience that it has, accumulated over the years to work on the SDGs and promote the SDGs and bringing people together. I know you're working with the youth, for example, you're working with K-pop artists. Yes. And I see there's so much potential to work for Ari랑TV to contribute to the dissemination of the SDGs and to encourage people to work towards the achievement.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed our interview, our talk with you today. I'd like to thank you once again for joining us today. 감사합니다.
감사합니다.
Now, as a broadcast presenter here at Ari랑TV, I was inspired by a great number of guests, wonderful guests joining us on our show, and today's guest was no exception. Ari랑TV and Heart to Heart will continue to be an inspiration to the worldwide audiences for as many more years to come. Thank you for watching today. I'll see you again next time.